Imagine being dropped into a frozen wilderness for 3 whole weeks with no tents, no firewood, no proper gear, and no hope of rescue. Snow would swallow your footsteps, wind would slice through your clothes, and every breath would feel like it was stealing warmth from your body. Most people today wouldn't last a night, but during World War II, countless soldiers were forced to face exactly that. They marched into forests where winter was not just cold, it was a weapon. Snow rose to their knees, rain soaked through every layer, and mud clung to their boots with a strength equal to any enemy. Shelter wasn't comfort. Shelter was survival. And if they failed to create it out of whatever they could find, the cold would kill them long before combat ever did. Their strength didn't come from gear or technology. It came from raw human instinct, the ability to turn earth, wood, stone, and even snow into protection when nothing else existed. Today, those techniques are barely remembered. But for the men who lived through those winters, they were the only reason they saw another dawn. A trench in winter was a miserable home. Without cover, rain poured directly in, turning the floor into a thick, sucking swamp. Snow fell endlessly, burying everything under heavy white layers that could collapse walls. Soldiers had no choice but to transform these open pits into enclosed tunnels. They scavenged whatever materials the war had left behind: corrugated metal ripped from ruined barns, twisted sheets of iron from destroyed vehicles, and timber cut from nearby forests. They laid beams across the top of the trench, then piled mud, sandbags, and even snow over the structure. With enough weight and layering, these makeshift roofs insulated the space below, kept the snow from falling in, and hid movements from enemy aircraft. They were far from perfect. A weak beam could snap under snow, or smoke from a small fire might stay trapped inside, making the air almost unbreathable. But flawed or not, these roofs meant the trench was no longer an open grave. It became a shelter primitive, cramped, but life-saving. Even with covered trenches, winter demanded more. Soldiers dug deeper into the ground, carving out underground chambers to escape the freezing air. They reinforced the walls with sandbags filled with whatever was available: soil, rubble, gravel, even scraps of clothing when supplies were low. Then came a surprisingly effective technique: plastering the inside with thick layers of wet mud or clay. Once dried, these natural walls became insulation. They trapped warmth so effectively that a single candle or small stove could raise the temperature dramatically. Inside these dugouts, the wind vanished completely, and for brief moments, men could rest without shivering violently. Wooden planks or duckboards were laid across the floor to keep them from standing in icy water or mud. These underground shelters were cramped, dark, and constantly at risk of flooding. But compared to the exposure outside, they felt like havens carved from the earth itself. While marching, soldiers rarely had time to build anything complex. Storms struck without warning. A poncho draped over rifles or branches became an instant roof. 2 soldiers could button their shelter halves together to make a small tent, barely big enough for the pair to crawl into. Beneath them, they scattered pine needles, branches, or straw to create a thin barrier between their bodies and the icy ground. These shelters weren't warm, but they broke the wind, kept the rain off their faces, and allowed them to rest long enough to keep going. In war, the ability to set up shelter in mere minutes often meant the difference between exhaustion and death. When winter turned brutal, soldiers used the very thing trying to kill them: snow. A thick snowdrift could be carved into a cave with surprising speed. Once hollowed out, the cave acted like a natural insulation chamber. Outside, temperatures might plunge far below freezing, but inside, the air stayed much warmer. Soldiers could even melt snow with a candle for drinking water, or dry their clothes slowly. Snow also blocked the wind completely, which made a tremendous difference. They reinforced foxholes with packed snow, branches, or spare boards to create winter defenses that were sturdier than they looked. But snow shelters came with risks. Poorly packed ceilings could collapse, and sealing them too tightly could trap carbon dioxide. Still, for thousands of soldiers facing the harshest winters of the war, snow became an unexpected ally. In deep forests, soldiers sometimes needed something stronger than trenches or snow. They built log-covered bunkers, underground rooms with timber beams laid across the roof, stacked thick like ribs of a wooden skeleton. Dirt, leaves, and snow piled on top acted as camouflage and insulation. Inside, the bunkers trapped heat from small stoves or lanterns, making them some of the warmest shelters available. These structures protected entire squads from storms and even from nearby shell explosions, but they required brutal labor, cutting logs with numb hands, dragging them through snow, and stacking them precisely was exhausting work. One improperly placed beam could cause the entire roof to collapse. Yet those bunkers saved countless lives, proving that even in the harshest conditions, effort could turn raw forest into a fortress. When armies moved into towns and cities, wood became scarce, but rubble was everywhere. Soldiers stacked broken bricks, shattered stones, and chunks of destroyed buildings into windbreaks, simple waist-high walls that shielded them from freezing gusts. These walls allowed them to build small fires that wouldn't immediately be extinguished by wind. They also helped hide movement from snipers or patrols. Even though these walls were fragile and temporary, the relief they provided from bitter cold was enough to restore strength and morale. Finally, camouflage nets became dual-purpose lifesavers. Originally meant to hide vehicles or equipment from aircraft, these nets were stretched over foxholes and pits to create makeshift roofs. Soldiers wove branches, leaves, and mud into them, turning them into weather-resistant canopies that caught snow, scattered rain, and blended seamlessly into the environment. Heavy snow could bring them down, but when used carefully, these overhangs offered both concealment and shelter, a critical combination in winter warfare. Mud was one of the most silent enemies of the war. It softened skin, caused infections, and trapped boots so tightly that men sometimes abandoned their equipment. Raised duckboards were the answer, wooden planks placed on the ground to lift soldiers above the muck. Doors from ruined buildings, broken wagon pieces, and even smashed furniture became platforms for sleeping and walking. These boards warped, cracked, and rotted under constant use, but without them, trenches would have become lakes of freezing mud that swallowed everything. None of these shelters were pretty. None were comfortable. They were built under fear, exhaustion, and freezing temperatures. But they worked because soldiers refused to surrender to the cold. They used whatever they could find: soil, wood, metal, stone, canvas, or snow to build a barrier between themselves and the deadly winter. In today's world, where convenience and technology shield us from discomfort, the knowledge these soldiers once relied on has almost vanished. But their methods teach a powerful truth. Survival isn't about having perfect tools. It's about creativity, adaptability, and the will to turn the harshest elements into protection.